Maybe you have found yourself in the depths, stuck in your own head, situations and circumstances that maybe drove you to a place where every thought you have is darkness and loneliness, and there's no hope, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe that's not you. Maybe it's not about circumstances or situations. Maybe for whatever reason, you just find yourself overcome with this sensation and feeling of this heaviness that comes across you and your heart and your mind. Maybe that's not even you at all. Maybe you're living your best life and there's someone that you deeply love that seems to be carrying a burden that they either just quite can't shake or they can't seem to get out of. We're going to talk about depression and what depression looks like, the mental, emotional, of course, psychological, chemical, all these other aspects and elements of what this looks like. How do we love those around us that are struggling with that? How do we love ourselves if we're in the middle of one of those circumstances ourselves? And so, hello, hello, hello. Pastor Josh Duffy here with you. Of course, this is the Westcliffe Climb. And of course, I am here with my good friend, Dr. Paul Looney, as we jump into the topic of depression. Paul, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. Gratefully, not in the middle of a depression right now, but depression really does hurt. It hurts sometimes in our bodies as well as in our hearts and our minds. Depression is one of those things that can come on gradually so that we barely even realize that it's overtaking us, or sometimes it's triggered by a great grief or loss and can plunge us into the depths rather quickly. Either way, though, whether it's gradual or sudden, depression has a lot of symptoms that show up at every level of our experience relationally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. Even our sleep and appetite tends to be disrupted when we're depressed. We
Hmm.
lose our taste for food, or we eat too much. We cannot sleep at all, or we want to sleep all the time. So many people who go through depression also have low energy, they have low motivation, they can't concentrate, their attention span is bad, their brain just doesn't function. In fact, in older people, it can be so bad that they develop something called pseudo dementia. They look like they have dementia, even though it's just a function of depression. People who are depressed can read the same paragraph 3 or 4 times and not it just doesn't stick. It also has social implications. People who are depressed tend to withdraw socially. They tend to disconnect from others. They often feel that others are better off without them, and they lose their sense of value. Their view of themselves tends to tank, and they also tend to have excessive and inappropriate guilt and feelings of unworthiness. In addition to those symptoms, thoughts of death and suicide are very prominent features, and the loss of interest and pleasure and overall apathy can cause a person to just go numb, where they feel completely cut off from their own lives. They feel like they've gone dead or cold inside, and spiritually feel as though God is nowhere to be found, that their prayers are simply bouncing off the roof. We see this in scripture in people like Job, see it in David, uh, people like Elijah, Jonah, have their moments when they despair of life. Even the Apostle Paul says there was a time that he despaired of life itself. And it's a tough time. But I hope that by exploring it today, we can shine a little light on the
Yeah.
problem and how it can be effectively addressed, whether it's in our own souls or in the soul of someone we love.
I love that. What is and I'm oversimplifying it, of course, because I'm speaking from a layman's term. So this is where you can shed light on it truly, is from the perspective of the nature nurture. So much we always think about, okay, is this an inborn type thing that's within the DNA of this person or something chemically where they already kind of are bent that way? Or is there some chapter of life where we just get hit upside the head so hard that we just can't seem to get out of the funk that we're in?
Yeah.
How much of it is one or the other, or is it a both and?
Yeah.
How would you articulate and
Yeah.
describe that?
Great question. It is definitely both and. We know, for instance, that women who have an two X chromosomes are twice as likely to suffer from depression than men. At the same time, while women are more likely to attempt suicide, men tend to complete suicide or actually kill themselves more frequently than women. Often it's because men choose more violent means like hanging or firearms. At the same time, if you look at genetics and you look at family history, depression is one of those mental illnesses that definitely has a genetic predisposition that can be passed on from parent to child.
Hmm.
So there's a definite predisposition that way. People can also be more predisposed to depression based on their personality and their general level of optimism. It turns out that the depressed people are more realistic about the dark world that we live in. People who are not depressed tend to be a little more optimistic and see
Right.
things through rose-colored glasses a bit more.
Right.
But with that genetic substrate of being a woman, being in a family that has depression, and often along with it alcoholism, that being sort of the genetic background, then there are certain life experiences that can greatly increase the odds that you will become depressed. One of those things is losing a parent early in life,
Mm.
other trauma, abuse. Um, if you have childhood and adverse events in your life, the more adverse events that you experience, the more likely you are to suffer from mental illness, and depression is at, way at the top of that list. Um, there was a big study called, generally referred to as the ACE study that looked at adverse childhood events. That's what the ACE stands for, adverse
Yeah.
childhood events. And the more of those you have, the more it affects um, not only mental health, but obesity, high blood pressure, yeah, other physical and mental illnesses. So, genetics, early life events, trauma, losses, people who lose loved ones, pets, relationships, go through breakups, rejection. All those disconnections in life can predispose us to depression, which disconnects us even further.
Wow. Okay. So, as someone who I grew up, I was heavily influenced by 90s music, grunge, they called it. Okay.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
And what I started wondering, the deeper I got into music, because I went all the way, I really started getting into anything from like 60s psychedelic stuff to 90s grunge music as a young musician, like learning how to play the drums, all that stuff from Jimi Hendrix forward were very influential on me.
yeah.
And and I'm not trying to pigeonhole anybody out there if this is kind of their bent. I don't want to raise an unfair alarm or a flag, but and honestly, there was so much that I noticed in the artists that I was listening to of either depression or death or suicide. And it got me wondering, like, and I've never actually had the conversation with anyone who may know until now. Are there any connections about with people that tend to be more creative, tend to be
Definitely.
able to, and what is that about?
Yeah. So we don't know all the answers, but what we do know is that certain genetic traits are linked, and people who tend to struggle with bipolar disorder and depression often do have a creative bent. In fact, a lot of people who write poetry or paint, some of the lyrics that are the most beautiful actually are born out of suffering and depression. Even looking at the Psalms, and you open your Bible to the middle, you're going to see some of David's Psalms are soaring proclamations of praise to God and glorious hymns to Him. But others of those Psalms are born out of suffering and sorrow and pain and grief and loss. And so David, who was obviously a very creative guy,
Yeah.
probably did have those ups and downs. There are certainly plenty of authors and artists, painters that suffered with deep bouts of depression, and certainly some of them ended up ending their own lives. I think John Steinbeck was one of those. I think Vincent van Gogh,
Mm.
died at his own hand. There are, a lot of links between that. And interestingly enough, though, if a person has a creative outlet, it has a protective effect in
Mhm.
terms of depression and suicidality. So it's very important for people who do have that creative bent to be aware of their potential vulnerability. Every genetic strength, I think, has a concurrent genetic weakness.
Mm. Wow. Okay. So how about let's start here. If you're walking alongside someone who is having this struggle, okay, and whether it is through an event or like you said, it's a series of trauma, they have maybe a certain degree of a genetic predisposition. One of the things I love about our conversations, by the way, I just want to say this, is while what we're doing is only 30 minutes, very sitcom esque in terms of its window of time, we never I don't know that you ever have given people sitcom answers and tie things up in a nice bow, and I love that. I love that it's very honest and realistic, that sometimes the journeys and the paths that we are on or we walk on may take a lifetime to work out, and I love that. What does it look like to set expectations or to be a friend of a person that you may love and care about, but this is an ongoing bout? What does that look like for us to walk alongside and love somebody well who struggles
Sure.
with
Well, I think
depression?
for anybody who's suffering, we need people who have compassion, but who do not pity us, who have compassion, but do not feel sorry for us. There's a big difference when you have compassion for someone, you see them as a fellow struggler and you see them as a brother or sister,
Yeah.
and you reach out. Compassion moves you towards someone. Pity and feeling sorry for someone often allows you to move away from them because you see them as disadvantaged in some way. Oh, poor Josh, he's so, he's hurting
Right.
so badly. We feel bad for you, but it creates this thing like, well, God bless him.
Right.
it's
Right.
it's not the same as compassion, which moves us towards someone. Now, the tricky thing with dealing with someone in depression is that anything you say is likely going to be the wrong thing because their brain is in such a dark stew that it puts a negative spin on just about anything. If you
Wow.
say to someone, like, if I say, Josh, you're such a bright guy, you're like, oh, if you only knew, like,
Right.
my
Right.
life is so in the toilet, or like, like, or I try to cheer you up. Um, Singing songs to a depressed person may make it worse. Now, it does turn out that listening to music that is mood congruent, like if you're depressed and you listen, if David gets out his harp and lyre and plays some of that music that was born out of depression, it actually makes him feel validated in a way and feel not so alone. So it's actually helpful for someone that you be with them and just reflect back that you understand where they are. Now that's hard to do because you want to pull them out of the depression and you don't really want to sit with them in it. But if you can sit with them and go like, so you're feeling like the future is completely black. They go, yeah, the
Yeah.
world is in such a sick state, and da da da. Like, wow, I can see why why that's discouraging for you. Um, you don't necessarily agree with them or disagree with them. You just like reflect back that you understand where they're coming from. Not that you agree with where they're coming from or disagree, but you just get it. Like, oh, so you're feeling unattractive and stupid. And when I meet with let's say it's a woman who's an executive, has 3 children. She's bright, beautiful, and she's sitting on my couch in depression, and she's saying, "Dr. Paul, I just feel like my life is a train wreck. I feel like every decision I've made is bad. I feel like I'm fat and ugly, and that if I die tomorrow, no one would care." So I'm sitting here looking at this woman who's attractive and obviously not fat. She's obviously not stupid and has a bright future. Her kids would be devastated. If I disagree with her and say, you're crazy. Like, you are not fat and ugly, blah, blah, blah. Like, I tell her, you know, how I see it. Is she going to feel better? Well, no, she's not. She's going to go like, I'm not paying for this, because
Hmm.
rather than feeling heard and understood, she's feeling judged and um, condescended to. Well, so if I can't disagree with her, should I agree with her? Oh no, that's even worse. Like, yeah, you are looking pretty dumpy, and like, yeah, your life is a pretty big train wreck, and
Right,
I
right.
can help you find a bridge to jump from. Like, no, 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 no. So
Oh,
I have to reflect back in my own words, not parroting her words, but in my own words. So you're feeling unattractive, and you're feeling like your life is really in a terrible state. You're
right.
feeling like you made a mess of things, and if you die tomorrow, no one would care. And she goes like, "Yes, that's how I feel." And you're like, "Wow, I can see why you're feeling so bad." Now, I have to resist the urge. So now I can. When if she said, "Yeah, that's how I feel," usually she will amend her position just a little bit. She'll say something like, I know God has a future for me. Or she says, I know my kids would really be devastated if I kill myself, so I'm not going to do
Right,
that.
right.
But sometimes I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. That's better. I feel, if she just gets a little bit better, and I don't say that to her, but if she broadens her perspective even a little bit and says, I know God's going to see me through this, but I just sometimes can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. Like, wow, I get that. Because
Okay, so go ahead. Sorry.
no, because if you've been living for very long, you know how it feels to feel dejected and hopeless and helpless.
You did a beautiful job, masterful job a week or two ago, differentiating the difference between feeling and believing.
Mm,
And we were talking about some of the Psalms and what we can feel, but what we may believe actually deep down about God is different than what we may feel. See, I'm listening. I am listening. So sometimes we may feel you were talking about, and we had talked about, you may feel like God has abandoned you,
yeah, yeah.
and you may say that, but what you believe about him may be still, I very much believe he hasn't left me. When it comes to depression, are we living it? Does it cross over into what we begin to believe? Or is it just an instance of really, really strong feel? I feel
Yeah,
that I'm
no,
this. I feel that
yeah.
I'm that.
Oh, I'm glad you asked this question too, because I do think that when depression really gets entrenched, when we get to the depths, it does affect the very foundations of our faith. We begin to doubt God and everything else. But there's an old saying that I think is so profound, and I don't even remember where I heard it originally. Many years ago, I heard this saying that you should never doubt in the darkness what you've seen in the light.
Hmm.
Never doubt in darkness what you've seen in the light. And I think that that's very profound, because when you're trying to read a book in the dark, you're probably not going to do a very good job.
Yeah.
You need to turn the light on before you really be clear about what's being said. And I think that those circumstances of our life that lead us to depression, that shake our foundation of who we are, who God is, what the future holds, that in those moments we have to call to mind something that we've seen in the past. And David does this in the Psalms. He says, I remember the goodness of God. I remember a day when I felt his joy in worship. Uh, Even anchoring in the history of God's people. Um, One of the verses that people are these days very prone to have as their favorite verses. I know the plans I have for you, plans to bless, a
Yeah.
hope in the future that cannot be cut off. And of course, it's being said to people who are in bondage for 70 years. So we like to think of it as like, oh yeah, I got hope for you. It's tomorrow. No, no,
Yeah.
it's further down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we do well to invite people to anchor in what we've seen of God's dealing with his people in the past. that there is a night of suffering, but that it is eventually followed with a morning of joy. And we do well to remind people of, and even ask them to share their history with God, because sometimes it helps us to remember, oh yeah, I remember that. When a couple is in trouble and they come to me, sometimes I'll ask them, so tell me about how you met, what attracted you to each other. Because if I can get them to anchor back in some reality that they experienced in the past, it can
Yeah.
help them to ride this wave. Love is what we feel on the mountaintops. Faithfulness is what we learn in the valleys.
Oh, that's good. Now that should be on a coffee cup. At the top of the mug is love, at the bottom is faithfulness. Fantastic. That's really great. So okay. Um then what tends to snap us out of it? If it is the kind of depression where a person can come out of it versus something that they kind of, maybe cycle in and out of type situation. What is it, that is it a series of events? Is it one
Well,
event? Is it a clarity of perspective? What tends to happen in your practice that you see?
Well, one of the things I encourage people is to imagine, like, if there's a gift in this, what would it be? If God is at
Mm,
work in this for good, what possible good could I find in this? And sometimes when you ask people that question, they're like, well, I guess it is helping me to realize that even though I can't feel God, I still believe in God. I guess it's helping me to realize that even though I don't feel worthy, and I feel like I'm despicable, I believe that God still loves me even when I can do nothing. Like, if you ask people to try to take a look at it, ultimately what snapped Job out of his deep depression was an encounter with God. It wasn't having his questions answered. It wasn't understanding the clarity about how he got there, or what God's intention was. It's just experiencing God himself. And I think we talked about the 23rd Psalm, and how when David says, even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear evil, for you are with me. And there's somehow I tell people, of course, that when we are faithless,
yeah.
we are confident he remains faithful. But it's when he seems to be faithless that we find our faithfulness to him. And we actually, if we can just keep putting one foot in front of the other, we believe that God will eventually lead us out of the valley. But sometimes we have to go deeper forward in order to go upward again. Sometimes we try to pull people out of depression before they actually find bottom and find what it is that they're looking for, or God
I
is
I,
doing for
I
them.
mean, what you've said that I hope that our listeners are taking from this is fantastic, which is number one, if someone's in that funk, don't just try to dispel everything that they're saying, counter everything they're saying, or try to set them up to fix their problem in 3.5 minutes or in a sitcom type way, but actually write it out with them. And I love that you challenge people then to think more deeply themselves about, where is God in my story? What is God up to in my story? Rather than you telling them. Because per your point, if you're just feeding them that, they're not really having to wrestle with that themselves. They're not having their own David type moment,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah. So when Jacob was headed back to the homeland, because God was urging him to go back to the land of his fathers, he knew he was going to encounter Esau, and was pretty sure that Esau would want to kill him. And so he has this dark night when he's pretty sure he's at the end, and he wrestles with God, and he won't let go until he gets the blessing. And try to encourage people, when you're in a dark time like that, when things feel threatening or lost, um, don't let go. Keep hanging in there with God, like Job did, like Jacob did, um, till you find out what is it that he has for me. In that 23rd Psalm again, he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. God has some provision in the midst of that pain.
Yeah. You know, Paul, I just had an opportunity to sit down with someone who they're in a bad season. They're not going through a hard time. And they now in their relationship with their father, it's beautiful. The last 2 years is what this person always would have dreamed of. Now they're telling each other that they love each other. They're telling each other how much they appreciate each other. But for decades, it was rough. It was critical. It was harsh.
Yeah.
It wasn't edifying in any way. But the last 2.5 years have been just a beautiful, glorious thing that God has orchestrated.
Yeah.
But this person is still in a hard time. They're trying to get some aspects of their life together. And they said to me, they go, every time I fail at this, or this right now, all I'm hearing are these horrible negative things about how I will never fix it. I will always be a mess. I'll never get it right. And this person looked at me and they go, and it's in the voice of my father.
Mm,
And I,
mm,
and I and I stopped them and I said, I just want you to hear what you've said to me.
mm.
What you've just said to me is the last 2 years. The only thing your dad has actually said to you is, I love you. I'm so proud of you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. But you have a tape running that's in the voice of your father. And I'm only making this segue because what I said to them is I said, that may have very well been something your dad said. I can't dispute that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's not what he's saying now. So my question is to you, and this was my challenge to her, is so then where do you think that's coming from?
Mm, yeah. Well,
And then thinking through the spiritual side of what we deal with this
sure.
too.
Well, one way to think about depression is that when things happen that knock the walls down, um, Jerusalem means possessor of peace, and when all is well, we have a certain buffer against negativity, against the
Yeah.
attack of the enemy. But when you get depressed or highly anxious, the walls come down, and in the words of Scripture, any stray fox can climb over the wall and steal your chickens. Um, but the idea for me is that when people are depressed, they're extremely aware of the voice of the accuser. And one of the things that Jesus says in the book of Matthew and in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Agree with your adversary when you're in the way with him, lest he hand you over to the jailer, and the jailer hand you over to the judge, and you not be let out." One way to coach people who are dealing with depression is not is to agree with the 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 premise, but not the conclusion. Like, yes,
Mm.
we are broken. Yes, we have messed up, and any one of us, if we take a realistic look at our past, could be overwhelmed with shame, regret,
Yeah. Yeah.
condemnation.
Yeah.
But fortunately, when we're feeling good, we're not tempted to do that, and we can put it out of our mind and focus on the future. When you're depressed, though, the enemy has an easy job of coming in and saying, "Oh, you're so worthless." And when you do take a step of positive action, oh, big deal. Like, yeah, you moved one grain of sand out of this mountain. Like, you're never going to amount to anything. People don't really care about you. Oh, you thought you did a good job, but you know that person does way better. So there is that sense of just being inundated with those voices. And I love your example that a lot of times the enemy depends on things that have some validity, but they're really not anymore true. And when we come into Christ, if you read Romans 7, Paul says, "If I sin, it is no longer I who sin, but sin that lives in me." There's a
Love
shift
it.
in my identity, and I don't have to. I can agree with Satan, like, okay, what's your point? Like, yeah, I'm a screw up, but what's your point? Like, it's no longer about me.
Right.
It's
Right.
about Christ in me and his finished work on the cross. And we do well to remember in those times when we all we can see is our filthy rags, that our righteousness is filthy rags. Um,
Yeah.
but when we're not depressed, we sometimes can convince ourselves like, oh, I'm a pretty good guy. But depression, again, it actually takes us to a place where we see things more as they are. And in one of the Psalms, which one is it? I want to say 160, I can't remember which one it is. He starts out saying, God, you are my God. My soul thirsts for you. My
Mm.
flesh yearns for you in a dry, weary land where there is no water. Like in the final analysis, there isn't anything worth living for on the planet.
Mm.
There isn't anything that is, that I'm willing to live for or die for, except for the goodness of God. And when I feel
Wow.
cut off from my experience of it, then I have to stay anchored in my certain belief that God is still good. And Job does this in a beautiful way when he says, even if he slays me, I will serve him. Like there's a sense in which he cannot go back. He's gone too far. And that it isn't any longer about how he experiences God personally. It's about what he knows of God.
I love it. 30 minutes. We did it. It's over that fast. Who
Wow.
would have thought?
Yeah,
Brother, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer?
I sure would love to do that. God, we know that you are the source of every breath. And God, sometimes we can live in the illusion that we have control,
Mm.
live in the illusion that we can measure up or be good or deserve love. When we're depressed, though, all of those illusions are gone. And we realize just how lonely and how profoundly defective and broken we are. In those moments, God, when we see things as they are, um, and maybe even blacker than they are, give us the grace to stay anchored in you, that our roots do go deeper when it's dry, when we do not
Mm.
have any physical um, evidence of your goodness, that we would stay anchored in your love and trust you that you will follow through. As David goes on to say in the 23rd Psalm, he says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. God, help us to claim that sense of your goodness, to dwell within that promise of eternal pleasures at your right hand, that in those dark nights when we can't see clearly or can't see the hand in front of our face, that we still remain certain that in spite of our lack of connection with you or our lack of experience of you, that we believe you are still good and that we still belong to you because of Jesus, in whose name we utter this prayer. Amen.
Amen. We love you guys. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye bye. Love you.